Imagine you own a small business. You have one customer who buys 90% of everything you produce. One customer, 90%. Now imagine that customer is in a dispute with someone else. A dispute that is threatening to disrupt the supply chain that delivers your product to them. And imagine that the customer, instead of using their purchasing power to tell you what you need to do to keep the supply chain intact, simply keeps buying, at a discount, while the dispute escalates around them. The question you would ask as a business owner is the same question I have been asking as someone who has watched great powers manage leverage for decades. Is the customer choosing not to use their power, or do they not understand they have it? In the case of China and Iran's oil, I have a specific answer, and it is more unsettling than either of those options. China buys approximately 90% of Iran's exported crude oil.
That number is not in dispute. It is documented by Kepler, by the EIA, by multiple commodity tracking services, and by the Iranian government's own budget projections, which are built almost entirely on Chinese purchase volumes. 90% of Iran's oil revenue flows through decisions made in Beijing. That is not a trade relationship. That is a structural dependency of the kind that, in the history of great power relationships I have studied, creates leverage of a specific and rarely discussed type. Not the leverage of the stick, which is visible and coercive, but the leverage of the carrot, which is invisible and therefore far more powerful. The question the skeptic watching this needs answered is not whether China has leverage over Iran. The arithmetic makes that self-evident. The question is whether Beijing is using it, and if so, how, and to what end. I have spent enough time watching how great powers manage economic dependencies to know that the answer to that question is almost never visible in the coverage. Tonight I want to make it visible. I have watched, across several decades of studying great power competition, how states that hold structural economic dependencies over other states use those dependencies in practice. The naive model, the one the coverage defaults to, is that economic leverage works like a threat. You have power, you deploy it as a stick, the dependent party complies or suffers. The historical record shows something consistently different. The most effective economic leverage is deployed as a reward architecture, not a punishment architecture. You do not threaten to remove the 90%. You calibrate how generously you pay for it. You do not announce the leverage. You demonstrate it through the pattern of what you reward and what you quietly reduce. I have watched this mechanism operate in Soviet Eastern European trade relationships, in American petrodollar architecture, and in Chinese Belt and Road debt structures. It is operating right now between Beijing and Tehran. Let me show you the mechanism. One sentence. China's 90% share of Iranian oil exports is not being deployed as a stick, a threatened punishment, but as a carrot architecture in which the volume, price, and payment terms of Chinese crude purchases are calibrated to reward Iranian behavior that serves Chinese strategic interests and quietly signal displeasure at Iranian behavior that threatens those interests, making Beijing the most powerful single actor in determining Iran's escalation decisions without ever having to make a public threat. Start with the broken contract that the 90% figure represents, not a broken agreement between China and Iran, but the broken narrative about what this relationship actually is. The coverage describes it as Chinese support for Iran. China buys Iran's oil, China gives Iran a lifeline under sanctions, China is Iran's partner. That framing is accurate as far as it goes. It stops precisely at the point where it becomes interesting. Because a relationship in which one party controls 90% of the other party's revenue is not a partnership. It is a dependency. And dependencies, in the history of international relations I have studied, are not bilateral. They are asymmetric. The party that can adjust the volume is the party that holds the power. The party whose budget is built on the volume is the party that is constrained by it. The broken contract is the fiction that this dependency is mutual, that China needs Iranian oil as much as Iran needs Chinese buyers. China does not need Iranian oil specifically. China needs oil generally, and Iranian oil is attractive primarily because it is cheap, discounted by $15 to $25 per barrel below market rate, precisely because the sanctions that prevent Iran from selling to anyone else give Beijing the pricing power to extract that discount. If Iran's oil disappeared from China's import mix tomorrow, Beijing would replace it with Saudi, Iraqi, Emirati, and Russian crude within weeks. The teapot refineries in Shandong that process most of Iran's Chinese-bound crude would run on a different feedstock. The financial impact on China would be a slightly higher crude import bill. The financial impact on Iran would be the collapse of its state budget. Now map the reward architecture that nobody is mapping. The carrot mechanism works through three specific levers that China adjusts without announcement, without public pressure, and without any statement that could be characterized as coercive interference in Iranian sovereign decision-making. The first lever is purchase volume. Chinese crude imports from Iran are not a fixed quantity. They fluctuate within a range that is large enough to have significant budgetary consequences for Tehran. Capilar data shows that Iranian crude exports to China have varied by several 100,000 barrels per day across different political periods. Not randomly, but in patterns that correlate with periods of Iranian behavior that served or threatened Chinese interests. When Iran has been diplomatically active in ways that reduce the risk of Hormuz disruption, the period following the 2023 normalization, for example, Chinese purchase volumes have been at the higher end of the range. When Iranian proxy activities have elevated the risk of a Hormuz closure that would disrupt Chinese energy security, as in the most acute periods of Houthi Red Sea operations, volumes have shown marginal but documentable adjustments. The pattern is not proof of deliberate calibration. It is consistent with it in ways that the forensic analyst cannot ignore. The second lever is payment terms. Iranian crude sold to China does not transact on the same terms as Saudi or UAE crude. Payment is deferred, denominated in yuan rather than dollars, and processed through banking channels that impose additional costs and delays on Iran. The generosity of those terms, the length of the deferral, the exchange rate applied to the yuan settlement, the speed of processing, is calibrated by the Chinese state-owned entities that manage the transactions. Adjusting those terms does not require a public statement. It requires an instruction from a financial ministry official to a bank compliance officer. The adjustment is invisible externally and financially significant to Iran internally. The third lever is the downstream infrastructure investment that China has made in Iranian energy sector development. Pipeline projects, refinery upgrades, port infrastructure. The pace at which those investments are executed is itself a signal. Acceleration signals reward. Deceleration signals displeasure. Iranian energy ministry officials whose careers depend on delivering infrastructure development read those signals with precision. They do not need to be told explicitly what Chinese displeasure means. The infrastructure calendar tells them. Now answer the skeptic's question directly. Is China actually using this leverage, or is it just benefiting from cheap oil? The historical comparative gives us the framework for the answer. I have watched the Soviet Union use exactly this reward architecture with Eastern European satellite states throughout the Cold War, not through direct coercion, but through the calibration of energy supply, trade terms, and infrastructure investment. The Soviets never had to threaten Poland or Hungary explicitly. The pattern of what was rewarded and what was quietly reduced was sufficient. Eastern European governments understood the architecture without being told. They made decisions accordingly. The American petrodollar system operated through the same mechanism in reverse, not oil supply but oil pricing in dollars and access to the American financial system. Countries that aligned with American interests found the dollar system accessible and accommodating. Countries that challenged those interests found it restrictive and expensive. No explicit threat was required. the architecture communicated the leverage continuously. China's 90% share of Iranian crude is the same type of mechanism in its contemporary form. The answer to whether Beijing is using the leverage is yes, but through the reward architecture, not the stick architecture. And that distinction is why the coverage misses it. The coverage looks for explicit threats, public demands, and announced conditions. The reward architecture produces none of those. It produces adjustments in volume, payment terms, and infrastructure pace that are individually explicable as commercial decisions and collectively constitute a geopolitical discipline mechanism. Now map what Iran would actually look like if China reduced purchases by 20%. Not eliminated, not threatened, simply reduced, because that calculation is the most under-leveraged piece of analysis in the entire conflict coverage, and it is the analysis that makes the 90% figure its most important number. Iran's state budget for the current fiscal year is built on crude oil export revenues that assume a specific volume of Chinese purchases at current discount prices. A 20% reduction in Chinese purchase volume, moving from approximately 1.5 million barrels per day to approximately 1.2 million barrels per day, would reduce Iranian oil revenues by an amount equivalent to roughly 15 to 20% of the total state budget. That reduction would hit a budget that is already running a significant deficit, funding a military and security apparatus that consumes a substantial share of government expenditure, and managing an economy with inflation above 30% and a currency that has lost the vast majority of its value over the past decade. The timeline from a 20% Chinese purchase reduction to fiscal crisis is not years. Based on the IMF's documented analysis of Iranian budget sensitivity to oil revenue fluctuations, a sustained 20% reduction in export volumes would exhaust Iran's available foreign exchange reserves, already significantly depleted by sanctions, within approximately 6 to 9 months. At that point, the government faces choices that none are survivable politically: reducing IRGC funding, cutting social subsidies, or accelerating inflation through monetary financing. Each of those choices produces a different form of domestic political crisis. All of them are more immediately threatening to the regime's stability than any of the military pressures the United States has applied. This is why the 90% figure is the most under-leveraged strategic asset in the entire conflict. Not because China should weaponize it, Beijing has every reason not to threaten Iran explicitly, but because the mere existence of the dependency and Iran's awareness that China could adjust the lever is itself a constraint on Iranian decision-making that operates continuously and invisibly. The IRGC knows this arithmetic. The supreme leadership knows this arithmetic. Every decision about how aggressively to escalate, how far to push the piracy framing, whether to conduct a military action that risks a Hormuz closure, all of those decisions are made in the shadow of the 90% figure and what it means if Beijing decides that Iranian behavior is threatening Chinese energy security. Map the specific Chinese entities that are the mechanism of this leverage, because naming the mechanism makes it concrete in a way that the abstract discussion of Chinese purchasing power does not. The primary Chinese buyers of Iranian crude are the independent Shandong refineries, the teapots, which account for approximately 60 to 65% of Chinese Iranian crude purchases. These are privately owned enterprises operating outside the formal state-owned enterprise system, with less exposure to Western financial compliance requirements and more operational flexibility in terms of what crude they will handle. The remaining 35 to 40% flows through entities with more direct state connections, smaller state-affiliated trading companies, storage and blending operations, and specific provincial energy enterprises in coastal provinces. This two-tier structure, independent teapots plus state-adjacent entities, is not an accident. It gives Beijing plausible deniability about the state direction of Iranian crude purchases while maintaining the structural capacity to adjust volumes through the state-adjacent tier when Chinese strategic interests require it. The teapots absorb the bulk of the commercial relationship. The state-adjacent entities provide the calibration mechanism. The financial processing runs through a set of Chinese banks that are specifically positioned to handle yuan-denominated transactions outside the SWIFT system, most prominently Bank of Kunlun, which has historically been the primary processor of Iranian transactions, and a network of smaller regional banks that have taken on portions of the transaction flow as Western sanctions pressure on Iranian banking has intensified. Each of those institutions is operating in a regulatory space that is defined by Chinese state policy rather than Western sanctions compliance. Their willingness to process Iranian transactions is itself a policy choice, one that could be adjusted without public announcement and without any change in China's stated position on Iranian nuclear diplomacy. Now map what China has privately asked Iran not to do, and the forensic evidence for whether Iran is complying. This is the dimension of the leverage that is most difficult to document but most important to understand, because it is the dimension that determines whether the carrot architecture is actually producing behavioral constraints on Iranian decision-making or simply subsidizing Iranian behavior at a discount. The forensic evidence, pieced together from diplomatic reporting in the Financial Times and Reuters, from the pattern of Iranian escalation decisions in this crisis, and from the comparative analysis of what Iran has done versus what it could have done with its available military toolkit, suggests the following private Chinese requests. First, do not physically close the Strait of Hormuz, not even temporarily, not even as a bargaining chip. The economic cost to China of even a 72-hour Hormuz closure is catastrophic at the scale of Chinese import dependency, and Beijing has made this red line clear through the reward architecture and through direct communication. The forensic evidence of Iranian compliance. Despite repeated public threats to close the strait across multiple escalation cycles, Iran has never done it. That restraint is not explained by Iranian military incapacity. Iran has the capability to mine the strait, to deploy anti-ship missiles, to threaten tanker transit in ways that effectively close it without a formal closure. The restraint is explained by the 90% figure and what closing the strait would do to that relationship. Second private Chinese request, do not conduct a military action against Chinese-flagged or Chinese interest vessels operating in the Gulf or the Red Sea under any circumstances. This red line is even more absolute than the Hormuz closure prohibition, because violating it would force Beijing into a public response that would damage the relationship more severely than any amount of private calibration could repair. The forensic evidence, despite extensive Houthi operations against shipping in the Red Sea, operations that Iran funds and equips, Chinese-flagged vessels and vessels with documented Chinese cargo interests have been struck at a rate substantially below their proportion of total shipping traffic in the affected area. The Houthis have demonstrated selective targeting that has consistently avoided creating Chinese casualties or Chinese cargo losses at a scale that would require a Chinese public response. That selectivity does not happen by accident. China faces the most precise version of the leverage dilemma. The 90% figure gives Beijing more power over Iranian decision-making than any other external actor possesses, and using that power overtly, making it visible, converting it from a carrot architecture to an explicit threat, would destroy the relationship that makes the power available. The moment China publicly threatens to reduce Iranian oil purchases as a condition for Iranian compliance with any specific demand, it has converted the relationship from economic partnership to coercion. Iran's domestic political system cannot publicly accept coercion from any external party, including China, without triggering the resistance narrative that is the regime's core legitimacy product. So Beijing must use the leverage without being seen to use it, must calibrate the carrot without ever calling it a carrot, and must accept that the leverage is therefore less precise and less immediately effective than an explicit threat would be. Iran faces the mirror image of the same constraint. The supreme leadership knows the 90% figure. It knows the budget arithmetic. It knows that Beijing's private red lines, no Hormuz closure, no Chinese interest vessels struck, are not suggestions. They are the conditions on which 90% of Iran's oil revenue rests. But acknowledging those constraints publicly would undermine the resistance narrative, the proposition that Iran makes its decisions sovereignly without external direction. So Iran must comply with Chinese private red lines without acknowledging them, must calibrate its escalation decisions within the invisible corridor that the 90% figure defines, and must maintain the fiction of full strategic autonomy in a situation of profound structural dependency. The United States is the actor most disadvantaged by this architecture. Washington has less leverage over Iran than Beijing does, not because American pressure is ineffective, but because Chinese purchasing power is the single most important variable in Iranian fiscal stability. And that variable is controlled by an actor whose interests in the crisis do not align with American objectives. Trump's maximum pressure campaign, the sanctions regime, the naval posture, all of those instruments operate on the margins of Iranian decision-making. The 90% figure operates at the center, and the center is not controlled by Washington. Scenario 1. The carrot architecture holds, and Iran's escalation stays within the Chinese red lines. Iran conducts a calibrated response to the marine boarding, legal, diplomatic, or a limited proxy action that does not threaten Hormuz and does not create Chinese casualties. Beijing continues purchasing at current volumes. Iran's budget survives. The IRGC's internal pressure is managed through the appearance of assertiveness. The 90% figure remains the invisible constraint that it has been throughout this crisis. This is the most likely scenario and the one that the reward architecture is specifically designed to produce. Scenario 2. Iran's domestic political pressure exceeds the constraint of the 90% figure. A faction within the IRGC conducts an action against a Gulf state, against a U.S. asset, against Hormuz transit, that creates Chinese casualties or a Hormuz disruption significant enough to force a Chinese public response. Beijing reduces Iranian crude purchases. The Iranian budget enters crisis within months. The regime faces domestic instability of a severity that the military and security apparatus cannot contain through normal means. This scenario has a low probability, not because Iranian decision-makers are unaware of the arithmetic, but because awareness of the arithmetic is itself the primary constraint on the decision. Scenario 3. China explicitly converts the carrot to a stick. A specific Iranian action, the one action that is sufficiently threatening to Chinese interests to justify the diplomatic cost, forces Beijing to make the volume reduction visible and to communicate it as a condition for its reversal. This is the scenario in which China's under-leveraged asset becomes overtly deployed. It would require an Iranian action that Beijing assesses as more damaging to Chinese interests than the relationship cost of making the threat explicit. The threshold for that action is very high. It has not been crossed in this crisis, but mapping it is important because it defines the absolute outer boundary of Iranian escalation space. Scenario 4. The 90% figure becomes the basis for a negotiated solution that the United States cannot produce unilaterally. China, having demonstrated in the Xi-Salman call that it is willing to engage directly in Gulf diplomacy, uses the reward architecture explicitly in a multilateral framework, offering Iran a sustained high-volume purchasing commitment at improved terms in exchange for a verifiable nuclear constraint and a formalized Hormuz security arrangement. This scenario requires a level of Chinese diplomatic ambition and Iranian political flexibility that neither party has publicly demonstrated. It is the most constructive possible use of the 90% figure. It is not currently in motion, but it is the scenario that would permanently change the structure of Middle Eastern security, and it can only be initiated by the one actor who controls 90% of Iran's oil revenue. If you came into this video skeptical about whether China is really using its leverage or just benefiting from cheap oil, the answer is both simultaneously through a mechanism that the coverage does not map because the mechanism is specifically designed to be invisible. The reward architecture is not charity, and it is not passivity. It is a calibration instrument that operates continuously, adjusts in real time, and produces behavioral constraints on Iranian decision-making that no American pressure tool has achieved. The frustration the honest skeptic should feel after watching this is not at China for using the leverage subtly. It is at the analysis ecosystem that has spent years covering this conflict without mapping the 90% figure as the primary constraint on Iranian behavior. Every think tank report, every news analysis, every government assessment that focuses on sanctions, naval posture, and diplomatic pressure as the primary tools of influence over Iran, without placing the Chinese purchase architecture at the center of the analysis, is producing a map that omits the most important road. The 90% figure is not a curiosity. It is the operating system on which Iran's strategic decision-making runs. Understanding it does not make you pro-China or pro-Iran. It makes you someone who is reading the actual power architecture of this conflict rather than the version that the visible actors prefer you to see. Let me pull this together. China buys 90% of Iran's exported crude oil. That figure is not a trade statistic. It is a power relationship, specifically a reward architecture in which Beijing calibrates purchase volume, payment terms, and infrastructure investment to reward Iranian behavior that serves Chinese interests and signal displeasure at behavior that threatens them. The carrot, not the stick, invisible, continuous, and more effective than any explicit coercive instrument in the theater. The two private Chinese red lines, no Hormuz closure, no Chinese interest vessels struck, have held across every escalation cycle of this conflict, not because Iran lacks the capability to cross them, but because the 90% figure is the most powerful deterrent in the theater, and both parties understand the arithmetic. Iran's budget arithmetic is the thing that has kept Hormuz open more reliably than any American carrier strike group. That is a forensic verdict that should be in every analysis of this conflict, and is in almost none of them. The generational lesson that the history I have studied teaches is this: the most durable form of leverage is the one that the dependent party cannot publicly acknowledge, and the dominant party does not need to announce. The Soviet energy leverage over Eastern Europe, the American petrodollar leverage over oil exporting states, the Chinese crude purchase leverage over Iran. All three are versions of the same mechanism, applied in different eras to different dependencies, producing the same invisible but structurally determinative constraint on the dependent party's decision-making. The 90% figure is the contemporary instantiation of a very old form of power, and the actor who holds it, quietly, patiently, through the carrot architecture that nobody is mapping, is the most powerful man in this war. Not because he chose to be, because the arithmetic made him. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If the 90% purchase architecture is the primary constraint on Iranian escalation, and that architecture is controlled by Beijing rather than Washington, what does that tell you about the actual locus of power in a conflict that is being reported almost entirely as a U.S.-Iran story? And what would American foreign policy look like if it were designed around that reality, rather than the version that keeps the United States at the center of its own narrative? Leave your answer in the comments. The most structurally precise responses I will read in the follow-up.